Constructing an unlined patch pocket. The pocket hem or the entire pocket may need to be interfaced before constructing the pocket. The degree of firmness of the garment fabric and the amount of use the pocket will receive will help to determine the need for interfacing. In this example, a fusible interfacing was fused to the hem. The hem edge was finished with a zigzag stitch. To form the hem, fold the top of the pocket along the hemline with right sides together. Stitch the sides of the hem on the seam line, securing the thread by backstitching. Then continue stitching around the pocket just outside the seam line or 1/2 inch from the raw edge. This stitching is helpful when pressing under the seam allowances, so accuracy is most important. Trim diagonally across the top corner of the hem so that the seam can be pressed open. Use a point presser to help in pressing all the way to the corner. Reduce bulk inside the hem by layering the seam allowance of the hem. Then turn the pocket hem right side out. Manipulate the corner so that it forms a square corner. You might use a large needle or hat pin to help push out the corner. Press the pocket hem and the remaining seam allowances to the wrong side. Use the stitch line as a guide for pressing. The stitching should be rolled slightly to the wrong side and should not show on the right side of the pocket. When making a square pocket, the lower corners should be mitered so that the edges of the seam allowances do not show from the right side. Unfold the seam allowances and fold up the corner on true bias and press. Trim this corner to within about 1/4 inch from the fold. Then press the two seam allowances on the sides of the pocket so that the folded edges meet in the corner. Be sure that the sides of the pocket are straight and that they do not curve in toward the pocket. To help hold the seam edges of the mitered corner in place, overcast these edges together. Be sure that the two sides of the pocket are identical. Check by folding the pocket in half and comparing the two sides. The curves on a round pocket are treated differently. On heavier fabric, the seam allowance may be trimmed to 3/8 of an inch. Press under the seam allowance around the outside of the pocket, using the stitched line as a guide. Remember that the stitching should be rolled about 1/8 inch to the wrong side and should not show on the right side. Another method for pressing under the seam allowances is to make a cardboard pattern the size of the finished pocket. Lay the pattern inside the pocket and press the seam allowances over the cardboard pattern. Notice that there is excess fabric in the curved areas. This should be removed by notching the seam allowance in order to reduce some of the bulk. A smoother curve will be formed if you cut small notches and place them fairly close together. If the curves of your pocket have points along the edge, it is often a result of having the notches too far apart. The edges of the notches should just meet when you repress the pocket. It is important that the curves of the pocket be identical on the two sides. Check this by folding the pocket in half and matching the two sides. Pin or baste the pocket to the garment. It is easier to attach the pocket before the garment is completely assembled, because there are fewer pieces to handle. However, it may be necessary to check the pocket placement by trying the garment on, so it may be necessary to put some of the pieces together before attaching the pocket. Pockets are usually attached by machine. The first row of stitching is usually placed close to the edge of the pocket. You may use the regular stitch length or lengthen the stitch to about 8 stitches per inch if there is other decorative stitching on the garment. It is best to tie threads on the wrong side rather than to backstitch. Corners of the pocket should be reinforced. It can be done by stitching with this pattern or by putting in a second row of stitching around the entire pocket. It is important that the stitching be straight since it is so visible. This is another method for reinforcing the corner. Constructing a lined patch pocket. A patch pocket would be lined when it is desirable to cover all of the seam allowances on the inside of the pocket. The lining would also add more body to the pocket and would help to keep it from stretching out of shape. Interfacing can be added to the hem of the pocket. In this example, a piece of interfacing was attached to the wrong side of the pocket hem. The interfacing could be either fusible or the sew-in type. The lining is cut from the same pattern as the pocket. Fold down the hem on the pocket pattern before cutting out the lining. Then fold down about 1/2 inch in the top of the lining and press the fold. The lining is usually made from a piece of lightweight woven or knit fabric. Pin the lining to the pocket with right sides together. Make the lining slightly smaller than the pocket by extending the lining 1/8 inch beyond the pocket edges on all sides. This should keep the lining from showing on the right side after the pocket is turned, as the seam will be rolled slightly to the lining side. The lining will appear too tight, and the pocket will look a little full. The same procedure would be used on a square pocket. Fold the hem of the pocket along the hem fold line with right sides together. Notice that the pocket hem extends beyond the lining. Stitch around the pocket on all 3 sides, backstitching to secure the thread. Adding a lining to a pocket is desirable on fabric that ravels excessively, as it will help to control the raveling. The seam allowances should be layered, with the lining fabric being trimmed the narrowest. If you are working on a round pocket, notch the seam allowance in the curved areas. Remember to get smooth curves, make small notches and place the notches close together. If the pocket is square, trim the corners to reduce bulk. Also trim the corner at the top of the pocket. Turn the pocket right side out, carefully pushing out the corner and working the seam out to the edge. A large needle or hat pin can be used to push out the corner. The outer seam needs to be manipulated so that it is rolled slightly to the lining side while basting around the pocket. The pocket has now been basted and pressed. Hand stitch the lining to the pocket hem using a blind or slip stitch. Slide your needle underneath the pocket hem to hide your thread. Be sure that the stitches do not go through to the outside of the pocket. Pin or hand baste the pocket to the garment. The pocket can then be attached by hand or by machine. If no top stitching is desired, attach the pocket by hand using a very small slip stitch. These stitches alternate between the pocket and the garment. Notice that the needle is guided through the pocket fold right along the edge of the pocket. Be sure to use some extra hand stitches at the corner for reinforcement. The hand stitching should not show on the completed pocket. constructing an invisibly stitched lined patch pocket. This pocket is ideal to use when top stitching is not desired. The pocket is attached by machine, so it is still very durable. This technique is suitable for only the round pocket. Mark the pocket location on the garment with hand basting. Turn back a 1/2 inch hem on the top edge of the pocket lining. The pocket lining should be cut from lightweight knit fabric, the size of the finished pocket. In other words, the seam allowances have been removed. Place the right side of the lining against the right side of the garment. Be sure that no lining extends beyond the pocket basting. Pin the lining to the garment. Now stitch the lining to the garment close to the edge of the lining. Since the stitching is located so close to the edge, it is important that the lining be cut from knit fabric so that the edges do not ravel. Be sure that none of the lining fabric extends beyond the pocket markings. Interface the pocket hem if necessary. Stitch around the pocket 1/2 inch from the raw edge. Turn under the seam allowance and press to the wrong side. Notice that the stitching line is rolled about 1/8 inch to the wrong side. The curved areas can be notched at this time, or they can be notched after the pocket has been stitched to the garment. The pocket hem is folded and pressed along the hem fold line, but the ends are not stitched. Press the pocket thoroughly at this time, so only a minimum amount of touch-up pressing is necessary later. Be sure that both sides of the pocket are identical. Check by folding the pocket in half and comparing the two sides. Place the pocket over the lining and pin in place. The edge of the pocket should be just inside the pocket marking so that the pocket looks a bit full for the space. The machine stitching will take up this extra fullness. Pin carefully around all sides of the pocket. Carefully machine stitch the pocket in place using a long, narrow zigzag stitch. This is just a temporary stitch and will be removed once the pocket has been completed. This stitch should just barely catch the edge of the pocket. If a zigzag machine stitch is not available, the pocket can be attached using a hand slip basting stitch. To permanently attach the pocket, open up the pocket and stitch from the inside using a straight machine stitch. Start the stitching at the hem fold line and follow the line created by the zigzag stitching. Manipulate the pocket to keep the area being stitched smooth and flat. Stop the stitching at the hem fold line on the other side of the pocket. Remove the zigzag basting. If the lower curves were not notched earlier, notch them now or trim the seam allowance to remove the excess bulk. Turn away some of the fabric from the seam allowance on the pocket hem. Then turn the hem to the inside along the fold line. Bring the lining out over the hem and pin in place. Complete the pocket by hand stitching the lining to the pocket hem. The pocket is securely attached by machine, but has no visible machine top stitching. The lining finishes off the inside and adds stability to the pocket. Constructing an inset pocket. Inset pockets have openings in a variety of shapes. They may have a vertical opening near the side seam, or horizontal or slanted openings near the waistline. The outside edge of the pocket opening is finished with a piece of fabric which also forms one layer of the pocket. With right sides together, pin the front pocket section to the garment front, matching notches and upper edges. This pocket section can be made of self fabric, or it can be cut from lighter weight fabric suitable for pockets, such as stabilized tricot or firmly woven broadcloth. Stitch the seam of the pocket opening. This area of the pocket can also be interfaced if more reinforcement is necessary along the pocket opening. Layer the seam allowance and clip or notch the seam if necessary. When there is a concave curve, the seam allowance should be clipped. Remember that the clips must go all the way to the stitching line. Understitch along the seam line to aid in turning and pressing. When understitching, the seam allowance is turned toward the underlayer, or pocket side, and the stitching line is positioned close to the seam line. Pull the fabric taut on each side of the seam as you are stitching. Turn the pocket to the inside and press. Notice how the understitching helps to roll the seam slightly to the underside. If decorative stitching is desired, top stitch along the pocket edge. You could use 1 or 2 rows of stitching with matching or contrasting thread. This stitching helps to stabilize the upper edge and holds the facing to the inside. A piece of fashion fabric, called the pocket yoke, is usually attached to the upper half of the back pocket section. Pin the wrong side of the pocket yoke to the right side of the pocket section. The upper part of the back pocket piece must be made of fashion fabric, as it is visible from the outside of the garment. Machine stitch about 1/2 inch from the edge on the upper 3 sides of the pocket yoke. The lower edge can be stitched to the lining by zigzagging over the raw edge to control the raveling. If the fabric is lightweight, you can turn under about 1/4 inch at the lower edge of the pocket yoke and stitch close to the fold. The back section is now ready to be stitched to the garment front. Pin the back pocket piece to the front pocket, matching pocket edges and notches. You may find the back pocket piece to be a little narrower than the upper pocket. This makes the front of the pocket a little fuller along the pocket opening, allowing you to slide your hand in and out of the pocket more easily. Stitch the 2 pocket layers together along the outer edges. This stitching extends down one side, across the bottom and up the side closest to the side seam, just to the pocket opening. A second line of either straight or zigzag stitching, about 1/4 inch from the first, can be used for additional reinforcement and to finish the edges. The excess seam allowance can be trimmed close to the zigzagging to prevent further raveling. From the right side, pin the edges of the pocket in place to the garment front, at the waistline, and at the side seam. Machine stitch the layers together along the side seam and waistline to hold the pocket in place until it is permanently stitched to the garment back and to the waistband. Bar tacks may be added for further reinforcement at the ends of the pocket openings after the garment has been completed. Making and using bias strips. Bias strips are pieces of fabric cut on true bias. They may be used to cover cording or to finish a raw edge. Bias strips are usually cut on the true bias direction in woven fabric. To find the true bias, fold the fabric diagonally so that lengthwise yarns lie parallel to crosswise yarns. Press the fold, being careful not to stretch the fabric. Cut along the diagonal fold, which should be a 45-degree angle to the selvage edge or to lengthwise grain. Cut the bias strips the desired width and parallel to this edge. When a longer piece is needed, several shorter strips can be joined to make one continuous strip. Strips cut from knit fabric are usually cut in the direction of the greatest stretch, usually the crosswise direction. Strips that are cut on the true bias have enough give to fit around curved areas in a garment. When joining bias strips, it is important to join them on straight grain. Notice that the ends of these two strips have been cut on straight grain. Place the two strips right sides together and pin together about 1/4 inch from the cut edge. Open up the strip and check that the cut edges will be even on each end of the seam. Readjust the pinning if necessary. Stitch the strips together. Usually a 1/4 inch seam allowance is all the wider it needs to be. Notice that the sides of the strips meet at the point where the stitching is located, and not at the cut edge. Press the seam open and trim off the protruding points. If the bias strip is cut from striped fabric, it would be important to match the stripes when joining the pieces together. The piecing of bias strips is usually not noticeable once the strip has been attached to the garment. If the bias strip is to be attached to a curved edge, it should be shaped before stitching it to the garment. Since the strip was cut on true bias, it can be shaped by slightly stretching one side and easing the other as you press lightly with an iron. Bias strips can be used to finish an edge, such as on this bias binding. Refer to the tape on applying a bias binding. Bias strips can also be used to make a covered cording. Place the cording on the wrong side of the bias strip and fold the strip over the cording, matching the cut edges. The size of the cording can vary from very fine cording used in wearing apparel to heavy cording used in upholstery. Machine stitch close to the cord using the zipper foot attachment on the machine. This stitching will be used as a guide when attaching the cording to the garment. Machine baste the cording to the garment edge. Cover the cording with the facing. It will be stitched again using the machine basting as the stitching guide. Cording gives a nice finish to the edge of a garment, such as at the neckline or around the armhole of a sleeveless garment. Bias strips can also be used as facings. Here a bias strip has been stitched to an armhole of a sleeveless garment. Layer the seam allowance and clip the curved areas where necessary. Understitching can be used to help hold the bias facing to the wrong side. It also makes it easier when pressing. The understitching is placed on the facing close to the seam line. To finish the inside of a bias facing, turn under the outer edge and hand stitch in place. If decorative stitching is desired, the edge could be top stitched with 1 or 2 rows of machine stitching. When hand stitching, use either a blind or a slip stitch. If a bias facing is to be used on a curved edge, it will work much easier if the finished width is less than 1/2 inch. Applying a bias binding. When a bias binding is used to finish a garment edge, a part of the bias strip is visible from the outside of the garment. This tape shows the application of a bias binding to the neckline of a garment. Stay stitch the neckline edge 3/4 inch from the raw edge. Trim away the entire 5/8 inch seam allowance. This will be about 1/8 inch from the stay stitching. With right sides together, place one edge of the bias strip against the garment edge to be bound. Allow about 1/2 inch of the strip to extend beyond the finished opening. It may be desirable to shape the bias strip, stretching one edge a little to avoid wrinkling of the strip when turning it to the wrong side, or you may stretch the strip just slightly as you pin it to the garment. Pin about 1/4 inch from the cut edge. Placing the pins parallel to the seam line will allow you to check the appearance of the strip before stitching. Stitch the binding to the garment 1/4 inch from the cut edge. The width of the finished binding can vary, but it is usually kept quite narrow. Press the binding flat, folding it against the machine stitching. Use a press cloth if it is necessary to protect the fabric from the iron. Turn the binding to the wrong side, allowing just 1/4 inch to show on the right side, and press the fold. When the garment has an opening, turn under the ends to give a smooth finish along the opening. Excess bulk may need to be trimmed out from inside the binding. To finish the underside of the binding, the raw edge can be left extended on the wrong side and the binding machine stitched from the right side by stitching in the ditch. This stitching must be done carefully so that it falls into the crevice of the previous seam. When done with matching thread, it is hardly visible from the right side of the garment. This type of edge finish is often referred to as the Hong Kong finish. When used as a seam finish, a lightweight lining fabric is used to make the bias strip. Less bulk is created at the seam line by leaving the raw edge extended. If raveling of the binding is a problem, the raw edge can be turned under and the folded edge hand-stitched using a blind or a slip stitch.